We are in our last day of documents. Woo! We've made it. Today we're going to talk about the amendment to the purchase contract and then the termination notice and the release of the earnest money. So first we're going to dive into this contract to purchase amendment. So we have the contract date, the property address, by and between seller and buyer, and then it comes down to the paragraph number and the line number, and then a blank box for you to write in whatever term is being amended. Now, you may remember on the counter offer to the purchase contract, you had a similar layout where you had to enter the paragraph number, the line number, and then fill in whatever the term is that's changing. So it's very similar. When you use the purchase amendment, this would be used once you're under contract, you're already moving through the transaction, all the terms were agreed upon, and then suddenly something comes in and you've got to change one of those terms, and buyer and seller still have to be in full agreement and sign the document to accommodate whatever the change of the term is. If only one party signs, it is not a part of the contract. You definitely have to have all parties' signatures on the amendment for it to be added into the purchase contract. Now, some scenarios that would facilitate or require the purchase contract amendment would be the closing date. Say the lender, for whatever reason, can't close by the contract closing date. So you would utilize the contract to purchase amendment, what the paragraph number and the line number that closing date blank is on, you would write that or type in that information here, and then closing date to be on or before whatever date the lender tells you, or whatever date the title company confirms. If that's the only change, then you would come down to number 2 and put /A, or dashes and X's just on that number 2, just to confirm that number 1 is the only change, and then you would go down and have the buyers and sellers sign to agree. Sometimes maybe there's an addendum being added to the contract, like we talked about on the other day. Maybe the buyer needs to possess prior to closing, and they've sought legal counsel, they've talked to their insurance agent, the sellers talked to their lender, everybody's in agreement and can move forward with that. Then you would identify that paragraph. It would be the one on page 11 where the addendums are listed. You would put the paragraph number and the line number for that specific addendum, and then you would write the verbiage in the box that addendum whatever is added to and is a part of this contract. And then again, if that's the only change, mark the number 2 with NAs, dashes, whatever, and then let your clients sign, direct your clients to sign, buyer and seller, sign and date. There are different reasons for changes in a contract. You'll know when they arise, because then that contract amendment would be necessary. Another frequent type of change would be the type of financing or adding or removing a buyer. Sometimes the assignability of, if the seller was an individual who has passed away, then the assignability would then go to the executor of the estate or the administrator of the estate. So things like that do come into play. It does require a contract amendment. And again, that amendment has to be signed by buyers and sellers for it to become a part of the contract. When you do have a contract amendment, it's vitally important that you provide that contract amendment to the lender, the buyer's lender, if you're the buyer's agent, or to the title company if you're the listing agent. Even if you're the buyer's agent and you have that contract amendment, you can still send that to the title company, because the title company is working for both the buyer and the seller. But if you're the buyer's agent, it's your responsibility to get that amendment to the buyer's lender. Okay, and you also, of course, want to share it with your client once it's fully executed. All right, the next document that we're going to look at, I'm going to scroll past the earnest money release because we first want to talk about the termination notice. Okay, so the termination notice, if there is a defaulting party like we talked about in the purchase contract, or if there's a structural defect or whatever the situation may be, financing has failed, the appraisal didn't come in right, whatever the term is that the buyer and seller now have some disagreement on, or there's a discrepancy in, then the termination notice would be implemented. And again, that is discussed multiple times in the purchase contract, and then it's that paragraph on page 11 that identifies this document. So in the event that the contract is needing to be terminated, then you would complete the contract date, the property address, the seller's names, the buyer's names, identify the party that's requesting the termination. So if you're the buyer's agent, obviously you would click the buyer. If you're the seller's agent, then you would check the seller. Then you would identify the reason for the termination. So the reasons included herein are the Addendum A, the contingency notification for sale and closing of buyer's property. You would want to identify that the buyer's property did not sell, so the contingency cannot be met, so the buyer cannot pursue the purchase of the property without the sale of their home. So you would mark Addendum A, your buyers would sign and date, and you as the buyer's agent would present it to the listing agent. Addendum N, short sale contingency. As we discussed before the other day, short sales are their own beast. That is a contingency that has so many different special circumstances, and so it is possible for a short sale contingency to fail, and so you would mark this Addendum N. Buyers would sign, sellers would sign. Secondary contract, that would be a reason. Obviously, if the buyer would like to pursue another property and they want to be sure they're out of this secondary contract responsibility and commitment, they can choose to terminate. That is a legal reason to terminate. So buyers have the right to drop out of that secondary contract. The seller could also terminate from the Addendum S if the primary contract has met all contingencies and they just don't want that looming secondary contract. They can choose to terminate that. Listing agents probably wouldn't advise that because nothing is done until everything's signed at the closing. But you're always at the direction of your client. So next we have the appraisal. Again, if there are discrepancies in the appraisal, the buyer could choose to terminate legally. Failure to obtain financing, that could occur. The lender cannot close the loan for whatever reason. Floodplain or insurance, the buyer maybe cannot obtain insurance or it requires flood insurance. That is a legal reason to terminate within the guidelines and the dates within the contract. Government inspection, so the seller refuses to perform the repairs required for occupancy in a given municipality, and the buyer and seller have gone through those dates, the days provided within the purchase contract to negotiate those repairs. They've not come to an agreement, then that could be a reason to terminate. Homeowners insurance. If the buyer is unable to obtain homeowners insurance, they can terminate for that reason. The termite report or insect report, if there's no agreement on that remedy, that could be a reason. Inspection report, we've talked about that at length. Please give the seller the opportunity to perform repairs on that inspection response. If no agreement is made, then according to the terms of the contract, the buyer and seller can move forward then to a termination. Septic and sewer, again, that's on the inspection response. That's a legal reason to terminate. Discrepancies in the survey, title defects, issues with the well. All of these are legal reasons to terminate so long as they follow the terms outlined in the purchase contract and the buyer and seller have abided by the deadlines and the dates for those inspections or surveys or title to be performed, and then the negotiation or remedy dates have been expired and no agreement or no remedy is made. Those are all legal reasons to terminate. Sometimes there are other reasons, such as this could be tied into failure to obtain financing, but identifying that reason, buyer was laid off from their job. They can no longer close. Another reason we've seen it with the pandemic and all is that the buyer's hours have been reduced, so they are no longer approved for the financing. So you can put other reasons and then obviously provide an explanation. Buyers would sign if it's the buyer presenting, and then it would be provided to the list agent. If you were the list agent and the seller is terminating, then the seller would sign and date, and you would present to the buyer's agent. If it's a legal reason within the purchase contract, buyer and seller should sign to agree to terminate. If there are a defaulting party and a non-defaulting party, then that's when you would enter into either small claims or mediation, litigation, arbitration, legal counsel. If your seller or your buyer, they refuse to sign, then you definitely do want to advise them to seek legal counsel ASAP. So say buyer and seller, they have agreed to terminate the contract. So the contract then, of course, is terminated. Buyer and seller are no longer obligated under the terms of the purchase contract, except for the distribution of the earnest money. So that does need to be agreed upon. So now we have the earnest money release, contract dated, property address, buy in between seller and buyer, refund of earnest money. If it's a buyer terminating due to failure to reach agreement on repairs, then buyer would want the refund of the earnest money. They would sign and date. As the buyer's agent, you would submit this with the termination notice to the listing agent for the seller to sign and date. Sometimes buyer and seller don't agree on the release of that earnest money, the full refund of the earnest money. And so sometimes there's a forfeiture of all or part of the earnest money. And this is when the buyer and seller agree to maybe split the earnest money. Maybe it's half and half. Maybe it's 60-40. But say the earnest money deposit is $500, buyer and seller agree to split the difference. That way they at least both have something in their pocket, and the state of Illinois isn't going to benefit down the road, right? So in that situation, you would mark forfeiture of all or part of earnest money. You would put the $250 to the buyer and pay the sum of $250 to the seller. Buyers would sign, sellers would sign if everybody's in agreement. And once all parties sign on whichever, then this form is submitted to the title company or the company that is holding the escrow. And then that company would disperse the funds according to whatever is agreed upon between buyer and seller. There are instances where, say, the buyer checks refund of earnest money, they sign up here, and then the seller signs down here forfeiture of earnest money, and they may put $0 to the buyer and $500 to the seller, and the seller sign here. That is not an agreement. Yes, both their signatures are on the same piece of paper, but they are identifying different terms. So if that's the case, then your buyer or you as the buyer's agent would need to create a new release of earnest money and new terms or same terms and resubmit that to the listing agent for the seller's agreement or counter. And depending on the situation, this can go on and go back and forth. If there is no agreement, then the title company does hold that money, and after a period of time, that money is deposited with the state of Illinois and is no longer available. At that point, the buyer and seller would have to go to the state to argue their case at that point. And still, they would have to be in agreement, buyer and seller agreement to the terms of disbursement. So that is the discussion of termination, earnest money, and contract amendment. We have completed all of our contract documents. You did it. Take a breather, take a rest. When you have the mental clarity, go back to all of the documents one by one, or group them together like we did on our daily videos, and just review the information, learn the deadlines, learn the terms, the number of days, and practice, use scripts, practice doing that listing presentation or going through the purchase contract with the buyer so that you're comfortable with the language and with the terms, and that you're not so hindered or nervous or anxious about communicating that information. And again, always defer that these are legal binding contracts. And if your client is not sure or doesn't understand, that they should seek legal counsel. Okay, I think we're done. You have a great day, and get to work on those documents to where you're comfortable with them.